Okay, well, welcome to the Museum of Zoology and to our celebration of the bicentenary of Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, if you're watching this, you're probably well aware of who Wallace was, but if not, he was one of the fathers of evolutionary theory. It was Wallace, as well as Darwin, who came up with the idea of natural selection as the process that led to adaptive evolution. So as a core theory for biologists everywhere, it is really, really important, and we still very much use it today. So Darwin may be more famous, but we're not really going to mention him very much tonight, because tonight is all about Alfred Russel Wallace, who was, of course, born in 1823. It's 200 years since his birthday, since he was born. We're going to be sharing some of the stories that are in our collections that relate to Alfred Russel Wallace. And to tell those stories, we have our very own assistant director, Jack Ashby. Jack will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then he's happy to take your questions. So do pop your questions into the comments or into the Q&A. You will have noticed when you joined the webinar that we are recording this talk, and we will be sharing it on our YouTube channel within the next couple of weeks. So you'll be able to watch it again if you want to get all those details. So I'm going to pass straight over to Jack. Thank you.
Thank you, Roz. Thanks for coming, everyone. So my name is Jack Ashby. I'm the assistant director here in the Museum of Zoology, and I've got a few different areas of interest. And one of them is Australian mammals. Another is how museums present nature to the public, and how museums are sometimes biased in the way that they talk about nature. And my third interest, I'd say, is how museum collections have come together, and what are the colonial histories, particularly, of how collections like ours are amassed. And Wallace gives us a perfect opportunity to talk about all of those things tonight. So I'm going to hope to cover all of those points, but particularly looking at stories of how collections came together with an eye of talking about people that often aren't talked about in museums. And in fact, the biggest question that people ask about the history of our collections, or just our collections in general, generally when you go into a museum, people ask us this question: where did you get all this stuff? And traditionally, perhaps they were asking, wide-eyed and excited, where did you get all this stuff? But more recently, I've noticed that people are perhaps narrowing their eyes a bit and asking more suspiciously, where did you get all this stuff? And that perhaps suggests that people are realizing that there may be more behind the collections than meets the eye. And perhaps people are generally satisfied with a short answer to this question, which is that people traveling across the world sent specimens that they thought interesting back to us here in Cambridge to use in research about the natural world. But they don't really notice that doesn't answer the real question, which is, how did you get all this stuff? And that's a lot more complex, and sometimes, to be honest, a little bit uncomfortable. And natural history collections, unsurprisingly, have traditionally looked upon our collections as purely scientific repositories, that their value is simply just in answering scientific questions rather than telling human cultural stories. But that's, of course, a nonsense, because science is part of culture and as such has ingrained social biases. It's impossible to separate science from culture. And that's perhaps particularly true of natural history. Natural history museums typically focus on stories about animals, and that's just as it should be. But there's a lot to be said about the human stories behind our collections too. And I should say that science that's being done is of vital importance to understanding the biggest challenges that our planet's facing, such as biodiversity loss and climate change. And natural history museums are the only kinds of museums that can save the planet. That science that we are talking about is really, really important. But that's not what I'm talking to you about today. What I'm going to talk to you about is those human stories that are of vital importance too. And they're particularly important in enabling museums to better reflect the societies that they serve. And I'd like to explore some of those stories today. But the major exception to when museums have traditionally focused on stories about people is when we talk about what we call our hero collections, so the really famous individuals that capture everyone's attention. So I'm talking about Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace here particularly. We have in Cambridge an amazing collection of specimens that tell a biography of the career of Darwin through his specimens. And I'm certainly not arguing that people like Darwin and Darwin particularly doesn't deserve a display. But there's a definite trend to the kind of people that do receive attention in the kinds of stories that museums celebrate. And by contrast, the contribution, expertise, labour of certain groups of people, particularly women and people of colour, have been omitted from many of the tellings of the history of science. And in case it isn't obvious, and it really isn't obvious when you explore most natural history galleries, the discoveries that have shaped our understanding of the history of science, the history of society, history of culture, have not been exclusively thanks to rich white men. The fact that the work of everyone else is so often missing from the museums, the stories that museums are telling, just means that museums are not telling the stories truthfully, and they're not representing many of the people that in the societies that they serve, and that's bad for everyone. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the contributions of Indigenous knowledge and local experts to natural historical knowledge, and how those contributions have been represented. And I've been spending an awful lot of the last 2 years thinking about platypuses, which means that they work their way into pretty much every conversation I have, no matter the topic. So I'm going to start with a brief story about platypuses and one of the greatest zoological questions of the 19th century, to help illustrate this wider theme. So the first platypus specimens made their way to Europe at the very end of the 18th century. And when anatomists and other naturalists were studying these specimens, they caused significant problems for how naturalists at the time had arranged the animal kingdom, because platypuses, which I would argue are the best animals that have ever evolved, have a load of different traits that shouldn't be seen together, at least as far as those 18th and 19th century scientists were concerned. And nobody really knew where to fit them on the tree of life. They broke all of the rules for how animals were classified. And that had a number of different implications for just understanding how life fitted together. And it wasn't just, here is an animal they thought was strange, what should we call it? It was really fundamental to how the whole of the animal kingdom was grouped, and how even how people saw their own place in nature. And fundamental to those questions was how these animals reproduced, because when they studied these first specimens, the reproductive systems that they saw suggested to those European anatomists they might be mammals that could lay eggs, which was unheard of. So this is the fundamental question: can some mammals lay eggs? And one naturalist tasked with trying to answer that question was a man called George Cayley, who spent 8 years in the new colony of New South Wales, gathering information about the natural history of the country. And he put a huge amount of work into building relationships and learning languages to enable him to trade with the Darug and other Eora people around Sydney and learn from them. And in his writings, he regularly cites by name, which is really unusual, the local experts that he met. And on trying to answer these questions, he was asking them about whether platypuses lay eggs. And one of his letters that he wrote back, he said, "I asked several natives. At length, I learned from one man what I think may be relied on, who told me that they went a long way underground and laid eggs." And this isn't the only account of platypuses laying eggs that came from Indigenous people around the same time. Shortly afterwards, another, I think it was a scientist, Patrick Hill, wrote back, Kukungong, a native of the local Burra Burra tribe, which is probably the Barapa Tribe, says that this is in fact well known to them, that this is an animal that lays 2 eggs about the size, shape, and colour of a hen's egg. So there was clearly information coming back saying, yes, that platypuses and their relatives, the echidnas, are mammals that lay eggs, but in unfathomable displays of the classic colonial superiority complex. Many European scientists dismissed out of hand what they were being told from people who were actually there 12,500 miles away. And they decided in Europe that it was impossible for a mammal to lay eggs without ever having seen a living member of the species. And in the end, they would only accept that, in fact, this was the truth when they sent someone, if you like, one of their own, an embryologist from Cambridge called William Caldwell in 1884. And he was sent with money from the University of Cambridge, money from the Royal Society and the UK government, and a whole lot of resource to try and solve this big question: can platypuses lay eggs? When he got there, William Caldwell set off to central Queensland and started trying to collect platypuses, but he wasn't doing it himself. In fact, he employed about 150 Waka Waka indigenous people from central Queensland to collect platypuses and echidnas for him. And quite quickly after this, literally, he would use the language of armies creating an assault against platypuses and echidnas, but that's because he employed 150 people. He found the smoking gun evidence for what people in Europe were waiting for, to prove that actually some mammals can lay eggs. So he said, towards the end of July, which is 1884, I got the laid eggs from the pouch of an echidna. In the following week, August 24th, I shot a platypus whose first egg had been laid, and the second egg was partially dilated in the mouth of her uterus. And so this was the moment, this was one of the most significant moments in 19th century zoology. It was sent on telegraph cables to Canada. It was announced as the most important announcement ever made through telegraph in scientific nature. And it solved the problem of whether some mammals can lay eggs. And at this time, this had massive implications for understanding of evolutionary biology, because it's excellent proof for evolution. There are some animals that have some, if you like, reptile-like characteristics, like laying eggs, and some animals, some species, some characteristics that are mammal-like characters, like producing milk and having fur. However, this would have been completely impossible if it hadn't been for those 150 Waka Waka indigenous people that he employed. None of those people are mentioned by name, which is really, really unhelpful in trying to tell these stories. And in fact, the way that Caldwell went about engaging them is quite problematic. So he created an economic system around echidnas. So echidnas are the spiny ant-eating relatives of platypuses, the only other mammals that we now know lay eggs other than platypuses. And he found them a lot easier to catch, partly because they were a more significant part of the Waka Waka people's diet, so they were much more proficient at collecting them. And in fact, this is quite shocking. In the 3 years that he was collecting, they collected 1,400 echidnas from a small area of Queensland and an unknown number of platypuses. Now, when we normally talk about scientific collecting, it happens on a scale that is very, very unlikely to affect local populations. But I can imagine that taking 1,400 echidnas out of one ecosystem must have had some impact. But Caldwell created an economic system that was extremely unethical. He was paying his local collectors for their work, which is to his credit, and certainly isn't something that happened often. He paid them £0.50 for every female echidna. However, because they were in a camp where he was pretty much the only place that the money could be spent, he kept changing the prices of the tea and the flour and the sugar that he was selling them, so that effectively the money that he was giving them was worth less and less, depending on how many echidnas he needed. So he was creating an economy in which echidna was the only unit of currency, and he would make sure that they were the value of the money was always sufficient to buy enough echidnas off of them, which is, I would say, quite problematic. So at the end of all this, rather than listening to the evidence that had been gathered not only from indigenous experts for those 80 years of colonization, in fact, it's more like 100 years of colonization, 80 years since platypus has been known to Europeans, rather than taking that evidence that indigenous people have been telling them that echidnas lay eggs and platypuses lay eggs, as well as several colonists themselves, it seems that people in Europe would only believe this apparently unlikely zoological fact that some mammals can lay eggs if they heard it from one of their own, someone sent from the great imperial monolith of the University of Cambridge. And they also imposed the structure where Australia was able to provide the physical work, were able to provide the data, but only Britain was allowed to develop the theories, the intellectual work. And that's why it was Caldwell that they believed and nobody else. So Caldwell was a Cambridge man. When I started working here at the museum, I was very excited about the possibility of finding Caldwell's collections. I asked our collections manager, Matt Lowe, where's the Caldwell collection, expecting there to be rows and rows of 1,400 echidnas and many platypuses. And Caldwell also did some amazing work on marsupial embryos. But Matt told me, oh, I don't know, we don't have those specimens. And then about 6 months later, I was extremely excited because he came into my office and took me to our stores and showed me this little box, which is it's about 10 inches long. And in it are 12 vials. And inside the vials are tiny, tiny baby platypuses and echidnas. We had rediscovered these specimens that proved that some mammals lay eggs. We can hold in our hands these little tiny baby echidnas. Baby echidnas are called puggles. So this is a puggle that are at this threshold moment of the history of science. So this specimen would have been collected by First Nations Australia in 1884 and solved this massive mystery in the history of Australian mammals. Now, excuse me 1 second while I make a horrendous plug. All of this story and many others like it are in the book Platypus Matters that came out just a few months ago. So if you are interested in the history of platypuses and all Australian mammals and how we came to know them and how their stories are represented around the world, there's this book. Okay, so now we've got platypuses out of the way, let's turn to the initial reason why we've actually put this event on this evening, and that's to talk about Alfred Russel Wallace. So as Ros said, this is Wallace's 200th birthday, and Wallace is an absolute scientific giant. He is up there on a par with Darwin. In fact, if you ask many evolutionary biologists, they'd probably tell you that they prefer Wallace to Darwin. He seems much more like someone that you might want to spend more time with than Darwin, more a friendly folk. But he, as Ross said, co-discovered evolution by natural selection. He added mountains of invaluable specimens to museums worldwide, which resulted in the description of hundreds of new species. He founded entire scientific disciplines based on his interpretations of what they saw. So he founded the science of biogeography, which is how we understand where species live in the world. And he is definitely one of these people that we would call a hero collection. We'd point to a specimen and say proudly, this was collected by Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, I've been researching some of the birds that Wallace brought back from his 8-year voyage to the Malay archipelago. And he amassed an astonishing 125,000 specimens during that voyage, particularly of insects and birds. And perhaps it's blindingly obvious that Wallace didn't collect 125,000 specimens himself. But we very rarely discuss the team of experts that actually were behind much of the locating, catching, preserving, and describing of Wallace's specimens. And to be fair, Wallace himself often gives a lot of credit to the people of colour who collected much of his material. But that part of the story, as I say, has often been sidelined. And although Wallace certainly doesn't mention by name every collecting assistant that he employs, a teenager from Sarawak called Ali, who was just 15 most likely when he joined Wallace's voyage, was perhaps Wallace's most trusted expedition member and closest companion on the voyage. And a 16-year-old named Badaroon from Celebes also provided massive contributions to Wallace's work. And Wallace respected them, their insights, their Islamic faith and their wishes, and he wrote openly about their part in his accomplishments, particularly in his travelogue, the Malay Archipelago. And Ali's contribution particularly was absolutely enormous. He collected many or most of the 8,050 birds that Wallace brought back from the Malay voyage. And Ali would have prepared the majority of them too. So I've been trying to follow the paper trail to see if it's possible to identify which specimens in Wallace's collections were actually collected by Ali or Badaroon. And unfortunately, I found that it's impossible in most cases because, and this is a very common problem, these weren't documented in Wallace's field notes. Actually, he was collecting the material. And that's true of many times when you are looking for the contributions of local Indigenous collectors. However, there are 2 instances where I could, and I am just going to stop sharing my screen because I think it might be more interesting to see these on screen in the flesh. So these 2 examples that I'm going to show you show 2 different kinds of attitudes in one man, in Alfred Russel Wallace, to the people he was working with or coming across on the Malay Archipelago. And we have here in Cambridge what appears to be Alfred Wallace's personal specimen of Wallace's standard wing bird of paradise. This is always slightly fraught, talking and handling a priceless object at the same time. But Wallace is credited with discovering this species on this voyage. So it's named after him, the Wallace's standard wing bird of paradise. And this specimen was collected around the very time that the theory of natural selection came to Wallace on his malarial sickbed. And in Wallace's published travelogue, he himself wrote this about this specimen. And I think this is amazing that you can read something that Wallace published in 1887, and it's written about this very specimen that I'm holding in my hand. It's an amazing thing, power of museum specimens. So Wallace wrote this about this specimen. Just as I got home, I overtook Ali returning from shooting with some birds hanging from his belt. He seemed much pleased and said, "Look here, sir, what a curious bird," holding out what at first completely puzzled me. I saw a bird with a mass of splendid green feathers on its breast, elongated into two glittering tufts. Light on there. But what I could not understand was a pair of long white feathers, which stuck straight out from each shoulder. Ali assured me that the bird stuck them out this way itself when fluttering its wings. They had remained so without his touching of them. I now saw that I had got a great prize, no less than a completely new form of the bird of paradise, differing most remarkably from every other known bird. Now, incidentally, I should say that. So Ali has described to Wallace that they stick these feathers out and dance with them. Now, when we opened the museum in 2018, stood about 5 meters away, just over there. We handed to David Attenborough, who opened the museum, a specimen of a standard wing bird of paradise to install as the final object before we opened. And quite unprompted, David Attenborough then demonstrated the standard wings dance by sticking out his wings and doing a little flutter, which was quite a special moment. You can see that on our YouTube channel. However, back to these specimens. It's clear from Wallace's description that not only did Ali collect this first specimen of the species known to Europeans, which is this one we have here, and realized that it was unusual, but Ali also provided details of its natural history in the way that it danced. Nonetheless, the world has given Wallace the credit for the specimen, but according to Wallace's journals and published accounts, it was commonplace for Ali to make contributions like this. So despite Wallace's respect for Ali and several other of the Malay collectors he references, at times Wallace treats people quite differently, and his writing exemplifies a very typical deep-set colonial view of naturalists and explorers at that time. So another specimen from Wallace's voyage we have here in Cambridge is another species of bird of paradise, which is the king bird of paradise, which has got these amazing glittering little tufty bits hanging on these wires at the end of its tail. So this species is from the Aru Islands, which are in between New Guinea and Australia. And this specimen is in Wallace's Malay Archipelago travelogue. He proudly celebrates that Badaroon, the 16-year-old Malay teenager, had collected the specimen. So Badaroon was from Celebes rather than Aru, so he wasn't from the island on which the species was collected. However, in what Wallace writes, he goes on to write that the people that did live alongside the species, indigenous people of Aru, who were acting as his guides there, simply did not count in their experiences of this species. So he wrote, I had obtained a specimen of the king bird of paradise, the remote island in which I found myself situated, in an almost unvisited sea, far from the tracks of merchant fleets and navies, the wild luxuriant tropical forest which stretched far away on every side, the rude, uncultured savages who gathered round me, all had their influence in determining the emotions with which I gazed upon this thing of beauty. I had thought of the long ages of the past during which the successive generations of this little creature had run their course, year by year being born and living and dying among these dark and gloomy woods, with no intelligent eye to gaze upon their loveliness, to all appearances, such a wanton waste of beauty. It seems sad that on the one hand, such exquisite creatures should live out their lives and exhibit their charms only in these wild and inhospitable regions, doomed for ages yet to come to hopeless barbarism. While on the other hand, should civilized man ever reach these distant lands and bring moral, intellectual, and physical light into the recesses of these virgin forests, we may be sure that he will so disturb the nicely balanced relations of organic and inorganic nature as to cause the disappearance and finally the extinction of these very beings whose wonderful structure and beauty he alone is fit to appreciate and enjoy. So again, it is quite amazing that Wallace was handed this specimen in the forest, and those are his emotions that he has since written down. We can link back to this specimen. However, obviously what he writes there is quite a problem. So that is these words that he just wrote. And so I've just underlined some parts of that text. So he's written, beauty, he alone, the white man, is fit to appreciate and enjoy. So Wallace is suggesting that the people of the Aru Islands could not recognize the aesthetic beauty, nor had the intelligent eyes to gaze upon their loveliness. So in the emotional, evocative, he's a brilliant writer in terms of his turn of phrase. In that sweep of a pen, Wallace dismissed the experiences and understanding and knowledge of the indigenous people who lived alongside these birds in a way which I think many Wallace fans might find disquieting. So that's a different manifestation of colonial attitudes to indigenous knowledge, of the kind where Aboriginal Australians were asked whether they knew if platypuses lay eggs, and then their answers were just disbelieved. So here is Wallace is excluding the possibility that people of Aru could value or even have an emotional response to the animals that they lived alongside. So that's obviously quite troubling. So to move away from Wallace, I guess the point there is that when we write about colonial figures, it's often tempting to say, here is a hero and here is a villain. We have one person in Wallace saying that it's obviously there's grey areas and that he was someone to be admired, not just for his science, but also in the way that he credited a lot of his local indigenous collectors. But that certainly wasn't true for his entire output. So just to move on from Wallace, what I've been doing over the last year is a research fellowship looking at the colonial history of our Australian mammal collections here in Cambridge, which is very generously funded by the Art Fund and the Headley Trust. And the aims of this project were to look at, we have an amazing collection of Australian mammals here in the Museum of Zoology. And my aims were to understand the true history about how they actually got here. Who was involved in collecting them? Can I identify people like Ali and Badaroon, but from Australia, in the histories of our collections? Are there troubling or violent histories that should be told? And there are, and as I say, are there instances where we should be crediting local and indigenous labour that has been overwritten or omitted from their histories? So this is one of the most exciting things that I have found in that history. And it's a little slip of paper that was in a crate of jars. And just, I don't know how well you can read this, but there's 4 things that really stuck out to me. So there's this crate of specimens that have not been catalogued. They came to the university in 1900 and were passed to the museum in the 1990s. They've been sat in another department, came to the museum in the 1990s, but we have been yet to document them until now. And so I pulled out this little slip of paper and it says list of marsupials. That's the first thing that excited me. So that was great, marsupials. And then from the expedition to Central Australia, and it was donated by Elliot Smith in 1900s. That also attracted my attention. And then there's one named species on here, Perigale minor, that really got my heart racing. So those things are exciting because I knew that the Europeans had only had one expedition to Central Australia prior to 1900. And that was in 1894, and it was known as the Horn Expedition, which was, as I say, the first scientific expedition to Central Australia, where a group of scientists, anthropologists, geologists gathered together from different universities in Australia to go to the very centre of the country and learn about the wildlife and the people that live there. Several new species were detected, were described based on this Horn expedition. And then I was particularly interested in Grafton Elliott-Smith. He's a very famous scientist and also anthropologist and Egyptologist that was at the university for a number of years, but was not on this expedition. So I was a bit confused how Elliott-Smith had ended up with expedition material from 1900. And as I say, there's this one species, Perigale minor, which really, really caught my attention. Now, just over my shoulder here is a greater bilby. Now, greater bilbies are amazing burrowing, tuber-eating relatives of bandicoots. They're marsupials that live across much of tropical and subtropical arid zone Australia. Their numbers have plummeted by about 95% since European invasion, but they are still with us. This is a greater bilby. But on this label, it says Perigale lagotis in the middle. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but Perigale lagotis, that's the greater bilby, that's him. But Perigale minor is the lesser bilby. Now, lesser bilbies went extinct in the 1960s and are relatively rare in museum collections. So it's like, have we got a lesser bilby in this collection? Another name that pulled out is Dasyuroides burnii, which he was described on the Horn expedition. So I was interested to see whether we had some of the first examples of the species known to Europeans. So I started delving into this and trying to understand why we might have ended up with this collection, but also just trying to understand who was behind collecting it and how did it get to Cambridge, and what are the true stories of where it came from. So Baldwin Spencer was the zoologist on the expedition, and he wrote in one of his species descriptions of this, I should say, the kawari. This is a kawari, bottom left. It's one of those species that was described as a result of the expedition. It's about the size of a squirrel. It's a small carnivorous marsupial related to Tasmanian devils and quolls, but just the size of a squirrel. And they lived just around central Australia. This was the first time that Europeans had encountered them. Now, it is known as Dasyuroides burnii, and that is naming burn in its species name. And Baldwin Spencer, who was, as I say, the zoologist in there, writes, "My warmest thanks are due to my friend, Mr. P.M. Byrne, who, under difficulties of collecting and transit, which cannot be fully appreciated unless one has personally endeavoured to collect in Central Australia during the hot season, secured the specimens which are now described." So in what Spencer writes, it's very, very clear, apparently, that Mr. P.M. Byrne was the collector responsible for the mammals that Spencer received. And looking deeper into this, it's clear that we found 30 years of letters between Byrne and Spencer, where he is sending material back to Melbourne from Central Australia. So the Horn expedition goes to where Byrne lived, a little settlement called Charlotte Waters. And they did some collecting there, but actually most of the material came in the 20 years afterwards, where Byrne kept on sending Spencer more material. And so I'm like, okay, this is interesting, but not that interesting, because it's just another white man collecting for another white man. And I was about to give up, but then came across a selection of letters, which were, I have to say, in a horrible handwriting. And I was like, well, these letters are here. Maybe there's something more. And we're incredibly lucky here at the museum to have an amazing team of volunteers. And two of our volunteers, Sue and Sam, kindly offered to transcribe these 20 years worth of letters from Byrne to Spencer. And they got some absolute gold. So in one of them, there's just this very short little couple of sentences where he's describing the lesser bilby that he's been trying to catch for several years. And he says, anyhow, thanks to the efforts of the blacks in spilling the spirits, they are fine, full-scented beasts, and little opopanox would be handy when you interview them. Should they be of interest, I will send the blacks out after some more with a good, strong vessel filled with spirits. So what he's saying there is that they've lost the alcohol that would preserve these specimens, so they're starting to rot. However, the important part is that Byrne didn't collect these specimens, that he is sending people out to collect on his behalf. And in fact, there's something on this photograph that suggests that this is one of these specimens, in that that's the hair's fallen out. So this skin has slipped. So this animal has started to rot before reaching Spencer. So that would suggest that indeed that's what's happened here, but not conclusively. And so this is brilliant evidence that Byrne wasn't collecting. And in fact, the more we read, the more it was clear that that Byrne didn't collect any specimens whatsoever. And in fact, it was the women of the Southern Arenta group in Central Australia who were responsible for all of his material. In return, these people were given government rations, however for their specimens. However, they were entitled to those rations anyway. Otherwise, they were given tobacco in some instances and photographs of themselves, which Byrne reports they were very, very pleased with. However, they were not paid in the traditional sense, and they're not named in any of the letters. I said something slightly inaccurate earlier. These weren't the letters that Sam and Sue transcribed. It's in fact a different voyage. Oh, different voyage, which I will get onto next. This is some very nerdy museum-based research where, because all I had to go on was that little slip of paper that said Expedition to Central Australia, I needed to prove that these in fact were from the Horn Expedition. And the kind of smoking gun for my research was, on the left is the specimen here in this museum, and on the right is a specimen that is definitely from the Horn Expedition in National Museum Victoria in Melbourne. And you can spot the label is the same manufacturer on there. So it's like, this was detective moment perfect. And also the handwriting is the same, particularly on the word minor here, it's perfect. So this was conclusive proof that this is specimens from the Horn Expedition. And my final example is another expedition. This is the one that Sue and Sam transcribed the letters of. And this is the Bulston expedition to southwestern Australia. In this case, there's a man called William Bulston, who was a paper maker. He paid for an expedition on behalf of the Natural History Museum in London to collect mammals, particularly, and birds from southwestern Western Australia. And he believed that this was an area that had been little studied. And again, looking into this expedition, there are a number of new species that were described to science based on this expedition, many of them small. And so on the face of it, this is somewhere that is very, very likely to find indigenous and local collectors behind them, because species that are less well known to Europeans are normally better well known to First Nations Australians, obviously. Particularly animals of this kind of size. This is a bandicoot, so kind of rabbit size, which is a good size for people to eat, and the species that Aboriginal people ate would be better known to them and how to collect. So in the Bulston collection, we have some here in Cambridge. There's many more in Oxford, and most of them are at the Natural History Museum. I expected to find, or at least I hoped to find, evidence that they were not collected by who we thought they were. But the collector on this voyage was a man called Guy Chester Shortridge, who was a mammal collector of some renown. And again, just as with Spencer on the Byrne collection, with the Burns collection, when Oldfield Thomas at the Natural History Museum in London described the species based on specimens that Shortridge, who was employed by Bulston to send back, he named species after him. So here we have a mouse, Mus shortridgei, which I have much pleasure in naming after its captor. Everything you read, both from Oldfield Thomas, who was receiving the specimens, and Guy Shortridge, who was said to be collecting them, suggests that it is Shortridge that's doing all of the collecting. He, as I say, he's a professional mammal collector. He designed traps. He wrote about what dates he was using. So quite quickly with this one, I thought, okay, this really isn't an interesting story. It is just the European collecting for other Europeans. This is the occasion where we then found the letters and thought, okay, let's just have a closer look. And in those letters that Sue and Sam transcribed, we found some real gold. Firstly, and this was reflected in the published accounts, it was very, very clear that Shortridge was talking to indigenous people about where species lived and how those species had changed in their range over time. And in fact, this expedition was hugely important, still remains hugely important for our understanding of Western Australian animals, which have suffered massive declines since European invasion. And Shortridge was there before foxes arrived. In fact, he was there whilst foxes arrived, and he was there whilst rabbits arrived, which caused massive problems to the local wildlife. And he describes how species have changed in their populations over the last 100 years. And he writes that this is down to indigenous collectors. He also writes the names and that different First Nations groups that he was working with called the animals. So that was all in the published accounts. So we had no real reason to think that anyone else was involved in collecting. But when Sue and Sam transcribed these letters, we found some gold. So just one little sentence here. As you notice, a lot of people, this is Guy Shortridge writing to Oldfield Thomas at the Natural History Museum. As you notice, a lot of people who bring me in animals are fond of giving them a crack across the head, breaking the skull. I have a great bother to get the natives out of it, as their first idea when they get an animal is to kill it, no matter how. So this is, again, implicit that people are collecting on Shortridge's behalf. And in fact, I found this specimen and many others like it in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History in the Shortridge collection, which has clearly been whacked across the head with something hard and smashed the back of his skull. So Shortridge is saying in this letter, this is not how Shortridge killed animals. This is how First Nations people killed animals. So here we have a collection, again, that is probably partially collected by Shortridge, but also partially collected by First Nations Australians, particularly Noongar people around Pengelly in the southwest. So there's another side to the story which we also pulled out of the letters between Shortridge and Thomas, and that it wasn't just First Nations people that Shortridge was employing. I say employing, he wasn't paying them, that he was collaborating with, let's say generously. He was also getting specimens and information off of settlers, but specifically fur trappers, pearlers, woodcutters, and miners. So those are all colonial extractive industries, and all industries that require deep knowledge of the natural world. So it just shows how the wider colonial economy in Australia supported the development of natural history knowledge. And colonialism obviously is a fundamentally extractive process. And knowledge of the local animal, vegetable, mineral resources was fundamental to the success of those extractive industries. And just to kind of end on a downer, I guess, he mentioned going out with pearlers off of in Shark Bay to collect dugong for the Natural History Museum. Now, pearling was an industry notorious in Australia for blackbirding, which, although obviously by this point slavery was outlawed in the British Empire, blackbirding was the process of people going around and gathering up First Nations people to work without pay or an indentured labour for settlers. So it's possible that those specimens that were collected by pearlers were collected under these circumstances, which is troubling. Otherwise, it seems from all of Shortridge's writings that they had great agency in what they were collecting, but also were shaping, this is where you should go to collect this, or this is where we should go as an expedition to collect this. Those Europeans that I mentioned were paid. There's no reference to any of the indigenous people being paid. And again, there's no names of who was actually collecting for Shortridge, certainly on the First Nations side. So that's deeply unsatisfying for the kind of research we're trying to do, because it's so much more powerful when we can pull back and say, this is Ali, even we have a photograph, or this is Badaroon's specimen. We can't do that for many of these Australian specimens, but that's part of the story. And just to end with, why is this important? Why is it important to just say, okay, this wasn't collected by Shortridge or Wallace or Byrne? And say one of the primary goals of this kind of work is to show that the history of science, the history of museums, the history of global knowledge is not only populated by dead white men. But unfortunately, because it was dead white men that wrote most of it, most Natural History Museum documentation is inadequate for telling the truth about how our collections came together and in a way that would allow us to celebrate the greater diversity of people that are represented in the history of science, who contributed to the history of science. But we do have to try, because otherwise museums aren't telling the true stories about how their collections came together. And looking for the alleys and the badaroons in our collections might help more people realize that museums are places in which they are represented, that people like them played vital roles in the history of science on display here. And I think to fail to do that would be a gross underestimation of our museum's relevance. So I am gonna end there. If we have any questions, pop them into the chat.
Okay, thank you for that, Jack. That's been really, really interesting. We do have a question that's come in. So Paul asks, Jack, thank you for giving visibility to the unheralded collectors. Do you think modern collectors, scientists and taxonomists give appropriate credit to local collectors?
Great question. So I would say that things hopefully are a lot better, and there's certainly acknowledgement of what's called parachute science, where a scientist from a Western organization might go into another part of the world, extract knowledge, extract data, and leave again and do the science in their home institution. That is, it is acknowledged that is not how institutions should be operating, which isn't to say it doesn't happen, but people are much, much more aware of that, and pretty much every conservation initiative I can think of will partner with in-country organizations to not just collect with them, but also to interpret the data with them, or collect for them, and they hand over all of the data to be worked in country by local organizations. So certainly things are better, certain also that they're not perfect, but things certainly are a lot better than they were in the turn of the 20th century.
Right, that's good to hear. It's good to hear that things are improving. I've got a couple of questions as well, actually. Oh, we've got one that's come through. It says, thank you so much for yet another insightful talk, Jack. Watching from the land of platypus. I think we've got some people watching from Australia. Fantastic. Hey, Jack, great talk and super to show the original specimen, even though it's very soon. But it's nice not to have only pictures. I agree. I have to say, when you first brought out those birds, I thought they all looked brown, but as soon as you put them under the light and the green feathers, they just, they shimmer, they're really beautiful.
Yeah, people get obsessed with birds of paradise, and it's easy to see why, because they're famous for the males doing these dances, and these are both males.
Yeah.
And females are chapped brown, but they are the archetype of going to the extreme of these astonishing decorations.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of brings me on to a slightly different question, but related to that is that obviously in museum collections we have quite a lot of the unusual. I mean, I'm guessing we have a lot more male birds of paradise than female birds of paradise. If you could go back in time, do you think you would want to represent nature a bit more like it is? Because we're not going to go out and collect loads of birds of paradise today, but if you were to go back in time, would you want to get more of a balance? Or do you think having the beautiful and the quirky and the sort of slightly strange overrepresented is a good thing?
It's not a good thing. It's absolutely true. So particularly for species in which males and females are very different. So many birds, but also among mammals, things like deer and antelope and animals with tusks. Often it's the males that are showier. Mm-hmm. So there is a massive bias in how they were collected, and there is, to be fair, there is a scientific reason for that, in that males tend to be easier to catch. Say about that what you will, but also there's definitely a collecting bias where people are like, what am I? And Wallace was the reason I know that that's his specimen is that in his field books they'll say he's written 158. One is that specimen, that's his specimen that he keeps for himself. 58 is the specimen, the other 58 specimens that he collected to sell. So he needed to collect specimens that would sell. That's how he funded his voyage. Many others like him. So that, it's the museums driving the market. So they're like, yeah, we're going to buy the showy ones. But that means that museums are holding specimens that are not representative of the species. So the science that's done on these specimens is biased towards males. So if males have a different diet, a different morphology, a different parasite load, any of the things that we could pick off of a museum specimen, that information is going to be biased towards males, which obviously isn't helpful in understanding the species. It's also, but it's even more biased for what's on display. So the collections behind the scenes are biased, but what's on out in the galleries is even more so.
Yeah. So as a feminist, I have to say that I totally agree. We need to have more female specimens. So we've got a few more comments and questions. So Elizabeth says, thank you, and so interesting. Catherine says, thank you so much for the brilliant talk. There is so much to be done, but I'm curious, where do you think museums should move first to recognise local or Indigenous labour and histories of science and empire? New interpretive displays, public talks, tours, perhaps?
All of those things, absolutely all of those things. So it's, as I say, I don't object to the fact that I'm sat in front of it. In fact, just there is a massive display of Charles Darwin. Of course, we should be celebrating Darwin and what we have and the contributions he made. But we need to tell the full stories too, and everyone else that was involved. And whatever mode of interpretation we have, whatever mode of storytelling we have, so talks, but also those stories will be in the gallery. So Ali's specimen, Ali's contribution is in our kind of highlights of the museum trail that you can take around. We will be adding interpretation, telling more of these stories once the research is done. We're creating a whole trail around colonial histories attached to our collections, not just Australian ones that we're pleased to hear, or maybe you won't, but how we're understanding how these collections came together. So I think we have, as I say, we have a responsibility to tell the other story about where they come. So any opportunity to do so, we should be taking them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess it's obviously with them being hidden, it must be much more difficult to actually find the stories and so that you can tell them. I mean, that takes a lot of work, doesn't it?
And that is a challenge for museums because the heavy fellowship that I'm lucky to have, is put into existence that Art Fund offer it because it's for museum curators who don't have time to research their own collection, which might be surprising, but people who have museums just don't have the time to go down the rabbit hole of transcribing letters and reading them. And we need the resource to do that so that we can tell those stories. And the end result is often, as I say, unsatisfactory, or we can't go beyond this was collected by people from Arenti Nation or Noongar Nation, or even just not the most certain on the label. I'm thinking, like, Wallace is on this label, Shortridge is written on the label, collected by.
So we've got quite a few questions coming in. Does the museum currently acknowledge the history of these collectors? Do you think that research like yours will feed into how narratives are told in natural history museums? Sure.
So similar to what I just said. So at the moment, the only story that is acknowledged of the ones I've told you is Ali, because I uncovered that back in 2020. It was a lockdown project. So the current work on Australian collections is very much in progress. But yeah, as I say, the aim is to get those stories out just as soon as we can in some form. Sometimes in label form, but sometimes also in paper trail form. So yeah, it's slow work, but it needs to happen.
Yeah. So we've got a comment from them. I think this might be quite helpful for you maybe to have a look at as well. Sort of linking to other names linked with Caldwell. And then Baker asks, great talk, thank you. Has anything further come out of the research into collecting practices, perhaps contemporary connections with the ancestors of Ali, Wallace's informant, better understanding of the collections and specimens themselves? Is it something you'd say is useful or important to research?
So the first part of that question, Ali's biography is relatively poorly known. So there is an account, I think it was a missionary. I forget who, or perhaps another collector. After Wallace, he goes on one other voyage, but then 60 years or 50 years later, he encounters someone else describes coming across Ali and Ali describing himself as being on Wallace's expedition. And at that time, Ali would have been 67. We know that he got married and had children. We don't know anything other than that, or even where he died. So tracing, people have tried to trace his descendants and haven't been able to. But I think it's important to do this research. It's useful for the reasons I said. It hopefully allows a greater diversity of people to recognize themselves in the history of science. Someone like me is very comfortable walking around a museum like this because, I'm constantly told that people like me built history like this. But I would hope that the aim of saying it wasn't just people like me, it was many other people from all over the world who have built global knowledge that we have now, will help other people feel welcome, feel inspired, feel that they're part of the history that's on display here too.
Okay, so I've got another question, and I apologise in advance. I'm not going to be able to pronounce all these words very well because they're new to me. But Lucky asks, he says, excellent talk, Jack. As a New Zealander, now in Oxford, conducting ancient DNA research on museum specimens, it is common practice to approach iwi tribes from the region specimens are sourced from to get permission to sample these important Teonga treasures. However, this relationship breaks down with the historic export of specimens overseas. Are you aware of similar conflicts with Aboriginal Australians or other Indigenous cultures?
For sure, certainly in ethnography world cultures collections. So that's absolutely also true for objects that are held in archaeology and anthropology collections in the UK. And it wouldn't be at all surprising. In fact, it would be surprising if it weren't the case for natural history too, because obviously the relationships that First Nations Australians have with animals is often one that is effectively ancestral, that they are, or that they're totemic. So the idea of holding their dead bodies in museums doesn't at all fit with that worldview. And it would be brilliant to connect these stories back to Noongar people from Southwest or Arrernte people from the centre. I'm just coming to demonstrate, the first step I wanted to take was to demonstrate this is definitely where those collections have come from, or what roles we could say First Nations people played in collecting them. I would absolutely love to make those connections. And there are museum research collections, particularly the Natural History Museum and National Museum of Scotland, who are finding information in museum records, museum specimens, and kind of repatriating that knowledge, so Indigenous names for species, back to those communities in a kind of wonderful collaborative process that is developmental for everyone. Where those names may have been lost, but they've been saved in the museum records.
Yeah. Okay. So Kevin asks, if we looked at recent specimens, would we find much more detailed information attached to them than in your examples?
Again, it really depends. So collectors are human. So it really depends on how fastidious people have been in attaching that information. So, I don't know if like me, I have things that I've found in the woods in my home, fox badger skulls, whatever. And I have to admit, I'm not very good at writing. Well, I mean, that I collected them because it's just a fun. But in 100 years' time, should someone find any of those things interesting, they wouldn't be able to unpick any of these kinds of stories. But I would hope that if I did have something that I thought was more interesting, I might be more full in recording its history.
Yeah, I guess you're getting me thinking now. Some of the things at home that I should put labels on with where I found them and when. Yeah. Are there any pushes by museums to showcase the Indigenous knowledge that enabled the Western collectors, as well as the labour of Indigenous collectors?
So I think if museums do that, it should be in collaboration with those people who can own that knowledge. There certainly are pushes to do so, yes. And it is a slow process, and as one of the previous comments made, it's quite difficult because you don't want to make these relationships short-term or further extractive. So it is something that requires a great deal of investment, of time particularly, but also of people, not just of the museum's time, but the partners' time. So you have to make sure that everyone is clear about what they want to get out of it. But yeah, it is certainly valuable if everyone is on board.
Yeah. And so we've got a comment from James. Thank you, Jack, for giving Wallace and especially Ali the credit they deserve. I'm currently reading the Malay Archipelago. Good book. You should read it. And it is awe-inspiring to see the specimens firsthand. The edition edited by John Van Wyde does a great job to credit several other Indigenous contributors too. So thank you. Yeah.
I mean, the power of museum specimens. When I had the Malay Archipelago open on the desk, and next to me is that specimen. It is amazing.
It's extraordinary. You should all come to the museum. This is a great place to come.
We do have some of Wallace's specimens just there on display.
Michael says, in regards to the dimorphism of male-female, would it not be easy to assume different species? How would they even make that connection back then, apart from birds, also thinking about stag beetles?
So there are a number of species that were described separately as male and female, but that's the problem with naturalist museums, is that everything is dead. Natural history is built on these two pillars of collections and studying specimens on our terms as slowly as we like, and really learning what we can see from the physical remains. But it needs the other pillar, which is seeing the specimens, the species alive in the wild, doing their natural behaviors. So when you can see obviously males and females together, and also once you take their clothes off, the skeletons are typically identical, except for obviously, well, in the birds at least. When it comes to things with massive antlers, obviously that has a toll on the skeleton. It happened often. The species is described separately. But,
I mean, there's DNA helpers.
Oh,
today,
absolutely. Today,
So thanks, Jack, for a really fascinating talk. This is from Emma. Nice to spot one of our platypus at the start. And then we've got wonderful talk. Are you a Wallace or Darwin fan, or do platypus win out every time? I think I can guess the answer to that one.
Platypus is obviously better than any human has ever been. But yeah, I'm a Wallace fan.
Yeah.
Happy birthday, Russell.
So hi, Jack. Worth mentioning that there are researchers in Sarawak itself who've been tracing Ali's history for a number of years now.
Great.
Got any more questions? I think these are all. And then Catherine says, you mentioned that the significance that local animal species have to Indigenous cultures may run counter to the practice of keeping animal remains in collections. Has your museum explored ways to be in good relation with Indigenous people while also fulfilling a collection's mission to preserve biodiversity as specimens?
The answer to that question is no, we haven't done that work. It would be extremely interesting, and obviously it's an issue that all naturalist museums, the truth is that all large naturalist museums largely have the same collections, so it's feasible that we could do together across museums and with Indigenous groups in natural history. That kind of work is relatively rare so far, but this is a surprisingly young field. So the work of looking at colonial histories has been going on for decades in anthropology, archaeology collections, but it might be surprising to learn it's literally 5 years that naturalist museums have really realized, oh, hang on, wait, it's not just science, it's not, science isn't pure. There are these stories too. So and so hopefully that is coming.
I mean, I think that links just fine to one of the things I noticed from listening to you as well, and that there are these people who we hero worship, like Wallace, who, if you've read any Wallace, he's a great writer as well. He's really fantastic writing style. But then you point out that, not everybody is wholly good, and there's that nuance in there as well.
Absolutely, it's black and white of heroes and villains.
Doesn't
how it works.
No. Well, thank you so much, Jack. That's been really, really interesting. And I hope you all enjoyed it too. You'll be getting a little email that's got a survey link. We'd love to know what you thought of the talk. So please do click through and let us know. And do join our mailing list as well. If you go to our website, you can join our mailing list and find out about future talks like this that are happening in the future. So thank you.